Why don't you tell us about the long history of the Australian relationship with America and how the hell did we wind up so entangled with them? And perhaps more importantly, does that make us special or are other countries similarly entangled? Because I'm not sure which is worse.
We're not special, Richard, as much
a favourite.
As much as we are desperate to be, we are not America's favourite. I think Trump has demonstrated that to us fairly clearly over the last couple of weeks. But I think Australia has always had an unusual relationship with America, and that is historically because of a foundational insecurity that Australian governments have felt about the nation, a nation that was built on dispossession and genocide and a need for a great protector, often one who is very far away. Originally, of course, the British Empire and Britain, and then after the fall of Singapore in 1942, the Americans. So Australian governments have always sought, someone else to protect them from what they saw as almost inevitable invasion by another power, and almost always another power that didn't look like Australian governments. And so what that has meant in our relationship with America is that our governments are always seeking a kind of guarantee or a reassurance that they will always be there and that they will always come for us if we need them. And that is built around the ANZIS treaty, our security treaty with the United States, which many Australians assume means that Americans will come for us, that there's a security guarantee for Australia. There's no such thing. There's a promise to have a chat, really, or a promise to act.
Which I'll take our call.
Yeah, maybe, if we're lucky. They might read our letter. And so what that means is Australian governments are always desperate to kind of shore that security up. And so they will do things like preemptively promise to help Americans in their wars, sometimes even before the Americans ask us to do that. And that's been the kind of historical logic of our relationship and has culminated more recently in the Orcus submarine deal, which I would always argue is a symptom and not a cause of the relationship.
And how do the Americans see that? Again, like we in Australia, our news is full of Trump. I suspect American news is not so full of Albo. But to what extent, if at all, is America sitting there thinking, we're so lucky to have Australia down there in case we need an ally in our next war?
Yeah. There's a few different schools of thought about this. I think the most obvious answer is that they don't really think about us at all. The United States is a huge power with a lot going on, and Australia is a relatively small country, and so they're not particularly interested in us. There's another argument that actually we are really important to the Americans geographically in, what has now become known as the Indo-Pacific, that the Americans need Australia to stage their kind of great power competition with China. But I really think it's kind of a mix of all of those things. And actually Australia is greatly respected in the United States. So if you ever go to Congress, if you ever go to the Capitol and spend time with lawmakers there, they have a great respect for Australians and are really interested in what we have to say, even not members of our government. They're interested in the Australian community. But I think they're interested in what Australians think because at our best, we can be a really good friend to the Americans and, tell them when they're making mistakes or doing things that are hurtful or might, end badly. And so that respect, I think, is really important, but it can be undermined, I think, by a certain subservience that Australian Prime Ministers in particular have demonstrated, not always, but increasingly, I think, since the Howard government.
There's lots to talk about, but you've already kind of alluded to the fact that, Australia likes to stare at that ANZIS treaty and just feel safe. I read something in the paper a week or so ago by an academic from ANU saying if the US, if China invades Taiwan and the US chooses to militarily intervene, the US might invoke the ANZIS treaty, and in turn we would kind of have an obligation to be at war with China. You know more about this than me, but that's all shit, right?
Yeah, I think that's the word for it. I mean, the ANZIS treaty doesn't, it obliges us to have a chat. So it obliges us to have a conversation with the Americans in the event of such a war, but it doesn't require us to do anything. It doesn't require us to do anything at all. But I think that's the working assumption, that we would, I think the former opposition leader, Peter Dutton, said it was unthinkable and kind of inevitable that Australia would join an American war with China. So the assumptions that drive Australian foreign policy and Australia's alliance with the United States don't line up with the reality of the treaty. But that's the drive, that's the assumption where you have, academics of international relations, security types, the spooky boys, as I like to call them, assume that that's what's going to happen, that of course we would join an American war with China.
Yeah, and I know I'm labouring the point a bit here with the ANZIS treaty, but I just genuinely think a lot of Australian politicians, the way the media talk, they talk as if it's this security guarantee. And of course, just to be clear, there's no such thing as a security guarantee. But here we are in Australia thinking, we've got this document signed 50 years ago that may or may not kind of bind the US to look after us in a time of need. But then at the same time, we're watching a US president saying, I might invade Canada.
Yeah.
I might take Greenland.
Yeah.
Like, how is it that anyone taking foreign policy seriously in Australia is looking at a 50-year-old document and looking at Trump and thinking, we've got this? Like what are they just pretending for our sake? Do they actually believe it?
I think some of them do genuinely believe it. They believe that Trump would be on our side, and how could we even imagine that the Americans wouldn't come to save us? The Americans are the heroes of our dreams. Of course that they would come and rescue us. But that drive, as I was saying, to kind of reassure ourselves that the Americans will come for us has always been there, but it's never been true. Trump is so good at revealing truths. I think sometimes he does it by accident, but the Americans would never, they might come to Australia's aid if we ever, in the worst case scenario, but they would only ever do that if they saw that as in their interests, if an American president saw it as in America's interests to come to Australia's rescue. And that's not a criticism. That's the job of a president of a sovereign nation, to make decisions within the national interest. What Trump has made clear, what Trump has revealed, is that he only would ever do anything, if he saw it as in, not in America's interest, but in his interest. And we can't predict how he would understand his own interests in the event of a conflict. And proceeding as if the Americans would come to save us is a pretty heroic assumption. And when we're talking about Trump as well, why would we assume that was a good thing? If Trump came to rescue us, what would that say about us? Nothing good.
And it would just be a giving gesture, no doubt.
Sure. Yeah.
So, Emma, you were in the US last year when the presidential election was on. I remember you came home a little shocked, but also you came home, to write the essay that we're here to talk about tonight. And before you wrote After America, you were writing about. I've already forgotten. What was their top secret long document of all the crazy shit Trump was going to do? The
Project 2025.
Project 2025. Yep. You were writing about that, before it was cool. You were talking about it after the election, saying, we know what Trump's going to do. Stop looking away. We know what he's going to do. Not just because we had Trump 1.0, but he'd told us what he was going to do. So given that you saw that at the time, because you read it, and were honest enough to look into it, sat back, wrote this essay before Trump was sworn in and doing all this stuff, why have so many people in Australian foreign policy circles and the media been surprised by Trump doing what Trump did last time and said he would do this time?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty perplexing, isn't it? When he told us, he told us exactly what he was going to do. He wasn't hiding it. And there was this 900-page dossier outlining exactly the kinds of things that he would do. And so it was all laid out. But, I think the Australian government in particular, but, perhaps the Australian community more broadly as well, has had this idea of the United States. We've sort of got a second-hand American exceptionalism that we hold on to, that, the United States is the greatest democracy in the world. It is, for better or worse, the kind of guardian of freedom and democracy in the world. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying, but that idea of America, of the best part of America, is deeply ingrained, and that combined with the idea of the United States as our protector is the kind of culture that drives Australian foreign policy and the kind of bigger bureaucratic structures, I think, of Australian foreign policy and defence policy. And that inertia is significant. Turning that around, changing those deeply ingrained cultural and political assumptions is really hard. It's really hard to confront this idea that the America that we thought we knew is gone and it's not coming back. What does that mean for the future of our security? What does that mean for the future in the world? These are big, scary questions that we're not used to having to answer. And so sometimes it feels better, it's more comfortable to not answer them and to assume, as so many, like in the commentariat and in the government like to do, that Trump is still an aberration. You still hear talk that, in the midterms, he'll be punished politically. The Democrats will win back Congress and, he won't be able to do anything. And then in 2028, we'll have a Democratic president or we'll have someone else. Like those assumptions about politics as normal in the United States still exist, despite what Trump is telling us again and again and again. And turning that around is really hard because it's confronting and it means admitting that, maybe you misjudged or you were wrong, but it also requires, some kind of bravery in thinking about, what we want and what we want to do and how we're going to drive our own foreign policy and our own role in the world. And we've not really done that before.
So we'll come back to where Trump might go and what that might mean for us. But, the Australian Institute's been around for a long time. We haven't had people like you working on foreign policy for that long, in part because I think most people in Australia think foreign policy it's not really a thing for us. It's, you read European papers and they're just chock full of what's happening in the neighbouring country. People in Europe are not smarter than people in Australia. They just live in a culture where they're like, maybe that might affect us one day. It's pretty rare to pick up an Australian paper and read what's happening in Indonesia. It's pretty rare to pick up an Australian paper and hear what's happening in Papua New Guinea. It's more common to pick one up and hear about what's happening in the US. What does what's happening in the US mean for us? If someone's walking around in the middle of a cost of living crisis in Australia feeling angry about Australian domestic problems, who cares about Trump?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I would always argue that we often try to draw lines between domestic policy and foreign policy or domestic policy and what's happening in the world, but we just can't do that. What Trump is doing in the United States and in the world matters desperately to Australia. The two things we have relied on in our role in the world, and the American security umbrella, as flawed as that is, and the international rule of law are both crumbling at the same time. And they mean huge questions for Australia, but not just questions of foreign policy, because the stuff that Trump is doing outside of the kind of big capital A alliance issues has huge effects on us. Trump, he's just threatened 200% tariffs on pharmaceutical exports. That will have an impact on Australia. But more broadly, not just in terms of tariffs, which, as we've discussed many times, Richard, you're the economist, not me, have more of an effect on Americans. They hurt Americans more than they hurt Australians. But big US pharma coming after Australia's pharmaceutical benefit scheme, that's got pretty big implications for Australia. And I would argue that's got pretty big implications for Australian security as well. Our health security is pretty important. So Trump shaking that up and threatening Australia with those kinds of tariffs and threatening Australia in response to things that we might do, like, I don't know, regulate tech, has pretty significant implications for our domestic policy. And I think that's why we can't draw, we can't pretend that what Trump is doing domestically is a kind of sideshow and isn't that awful, but that it won't affect us, because what Trump is doing at home is what he's trying to do abroad as well, and it has huge implications for Australia.
So to take up the point Emma just made, when Trump's imposing all these tariffs, he's actually just making things more expensive for Americans. It's kind of bizarre that he's going to punish the world by making Americans pay more for things. I think a lot of people believed, he just said that, he didn't mean it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's really interesting. Like when he came out with, Liberation Day, and announced these enormous tariffs, the media were just in shock. Like, he's doing the thing he said he'd do.
Yep.
How could this be? And remember, he said he'll invade Greenland. He said he'll invade Canada. He wants to make them the 51st state of Australia, 51st state of America. It's a top secret plan. So we often hear, particularly when Australians want to sort of ingratiate ourselves with the US, the starting point is always shared values. That Australia and the US have all these shared values. Yet, you've got an American president who's contemptuous of the Congress, who's governing by decree rather than by law. We've now got a Supreme Court that has said if a president does it, it can't be illegal. Are these shared values that we have? Is this coming soon to Australia?
It is wild that we're still talking about this. I mean, the relationship is often framed that way, that it's based on shared values, but it's pretty extraordinary that we're still hearing talk of that. It wasn't so long ago, a couple of weeks only, that the Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister, Richard Marles, went on the national broadcaster and talked about our shared values with the United States and specifically identified democracy and the rule of law.
Coming soon to Australia.
But I mean, I think it's really important to say, that it is still true that Australia's relationship with the United States is bigger than Donald Trump. Right, we have a long historical, cultural, political exchange with the United States that's much bigger than our defence relationship and much deeper. And so we do have, at our best, those historical shared values of democracy and the rule of law. What Trump is doing is trashing all of those. And we as a country have left ourselves open to that because we have so prioritised the defence and security relationship at the expense of everything else. So the relationship is based around really anti-democratic, closed-shop military ties that give us things like AUKUS, instead of a genuinely democratic relationship between, for example, the Parliament and the Congress. That kind of relationship is not prioritised. And so Trump can actively trash our shared values and make an absolute mockery of them. And that does really matter to us, or it should at least matter to us, when Trump is trashing democracy at home, when he can do whatever he wants because the Supreme Court has said when the president does it, it's not illegal. That has pretty big implications for those shared values and the way we see the United States. Trump is trashing the rule of law at home and he's trashing the rule of law abroad. And that should matter to us. I think we should be elevating our shared values.
I'm so pleased with myself. I came, as I was walking in, I was thinking, what am I going to talk to Emma about? And I thought, don't just talk about AUKUS, Richard. At least get to 6:30 before you talk about it.
Have we made it?
And it's 6:29. All
right. Okay.
So I think we did it. I think it's a really interesting point you just made, that for all the talk of the shared values, so much of the joint effort goes into the secret stuff that we can't know about. Pine Gap wouldn't possibly tell you what it did or whether it was involved in the recent attacks on Iran. Submarines couldn't possibly tell you what the effectively the rules of engagement might be. And as our colleague Alan Beam, I think, pointed out first, maybe not, so there's already Australians right now learning how to drive nuclear subs. Okay, they're on American submarines right now. And if America wants to deploy those submarines into a war, Australians will be going.
Yep.
They're in. There's no, hey, Captain, can you stop at the nearest port? I'm an Australian. I don't want to be at war with Canada. I don't want to be at war with Greenland. I don't want to be at war with China. Australian troops are now pre-deployed in vessels that we don't control. And if someone wants to use those troops in a way that we or our elected government might not like, too bad, so sad. Right? They're not getting out of that. So, Emma, can you start at the beginning perhaps a bit with what the hell is Orcus? And why is, as you saw in the video before, why is Malcolm Turnbull so sad? Rightly, I think, but it's complicated and it's an acronym and there's lots of moving parts. So let's start at the beginning. What is an Orcus? And does one need one in 2025?
One does not need an AUKUS. I mean, I think the simplest explanation is that AUKUS was a political stunt cooked up by then Prime Minister Scott Morrison, and sprung on the Australian people. It was described then as a plan for Australia to acquire nuclear-powered submarines, but there was no plan at the time. That plan was left up to a Labor government, which came up with one 18 months later. They called it the optimal pathway to the AUKUS nuclear-powered submarines, and as I describe it in the essay, it's neither optimal nor a pathway. But basically, AUKUS involves Australia acquiring eventually nuclear-powered submarines that will be designed in the UK and with US technology and then co-built in Australia. But there are a number of steps in the interim, including Australia buying US secondhand US Virginia-class submarines to kind of fill the gap while those AUKUS submarines are designed and then built. So we're talking a timeline of, at best, decades when between 6 to 8 of those new AUKUS submarines are supposed to arrive. The problem is that there are, in this optimal pathway, some pretty heroic assumptions about how we will acquire these submarines. The way one defence expert described it to me was that every link in the AUKUS chain is weak. The question is just which one breaks first. So we're talking about, we know that there are significant issues in the US shipbuilding industry, which is a long way behind and not reaching the kind of production levels required to meet their own needs, let alone the needs of another nation. We've already handed over $800 million to the US shipbuilding industry as a non-refundable deposit, I guess we'd call it. So we don't get the money back if we don't get our submarines. A couple of days after our government handed over that money, Trump slapped some tariffs on steel and aluminium, which is very kind of him. And then there are significant delays in the UK submarine industry as well, to which we have promised, is it $4 or $5 billion?
$5 billion, I think.
I think it's $5 billion. Also non-refundable, presumably. And then there are, of course, heroic assumptions about Australian manufacturing capacity, Australian industry. And so all of these, assuming we can overcome all of these obstacles, which many people are still assuming we can, we might, if we're lucky, get 8 submarines by about 2070, I think. And what a lot of people don't realise is that, 8 submarines is not very many to begin with, but usually the way submarines work, probably only about 2 of them would be operational at a time. So we're talking an outlay, well, the estimate is 368 billion Australian dollars. It's a defence budget, so you've got to at least triple it for 8-ish submarines that are likely never to arrive.
So I'm an optimist. And, you know, I spend most of my time talking about, you know, non-foreign policy issues, but you'll often hear the term wicked problem in Australia. And when it comes to things like climate change, you'll often hear people say climate change is a wicked problem. And once we call something a wicked problem, it's really clever because it's the problem that's the fault. Right? It's not wicked fossil fuel companies. It's not weak politicians. It's climate change. Oh, it's a wicked problem. No wonder we can't fix it. It's such a nasty little problem. The thing about why climate change is a wicked problem, so I'm told by clever people who I saw had buildings named after them outside. See, the thing with climate change is the costs are up front, but the benefits are in the future. Democracy doesn't cope well with this, you see, because the costs are up front, the benefits are in the future. And the benefits of tackling climate change are also uncertain. So costs are up front, bad. Benefits are in the future, bad. Benefits are uncertain, bad. And the real kicker with climate change, we can't even be sure that if Australia does something, it will tackle the whole world's climate. So it's a wicked, nasty problem. But Emma, when I look at submarines, I see that the costs are up front. Mm-hmm. The benefits are in 27. Maybe,
lucky, yeah.
if we're lucky. The benefits are uncertain. And if we have 8 submarines, will it deliver world peace?
Seems unlikely.
Seems unlikely. Yeah. So how come subs aren't a wicked problem? How come it's actually not only not a wicked problem? Let's just, to be crystal clear, this was cooked up by Scott Morrison, didn't go to Treasury, didn't go to DFAT. Our Pacific neighbours read about it in the paper or heard about it one night before, when you know where the nuclear subs will be travelling through their waters. And Labor agreed to it within 24 hours of it being announced. So how come climate's such a nasty, wicked problem and submarines, 360 billion's 50-year plan can be done without even going to Treasury for costings?
Because security.
Special relationship?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the former Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, said it really clearly when he was asked, I think it was a couple of days after the deal was announced, you know, how is Australia going to afford this? And he said, anything's affordable if it's a priority. You know,
right about that,
yeah, he's totally right, you know, and I think that's the decision that is made. And historically in Australia, defence spending has been elevated above any kind of accountability. You know, our accountability and systems of transparency are somewhat lacking, generally speaking, but particularly in defence. You know, there is no transparency, there is no accountability. That's why, you know, as I just said, defence budgets, you know, you've got to triple them, because that is how we approach defence spending in this, not just in this country, but in the West generally. And I think some of the ridiculousness of that has been highlighted in the last couple of weeks, and we've talked about this a bit, where we see demands for Australia to raise our defence spending to 3.5% of GDP or 3% of GDP, or demands for the Europeans to raise their defence spending to 5% of GDP, which, when you actually kind of dig down into it, is a pretty ridiculous way to approach spending. Like, you know, in normal circumstances, as I'm stealing Richard's lines here, we would work out what we need and then work out how much it's going to cost and then decide if we can pay for it. But we kind of do the opposite when it comes to defence.
Well, I'd go one further. When it comes to defence, we seem to have convinced ourselves that the more we spend, the safer we are.
Yeah.
And it kind of doesn't matter what we spend it on, right? Because we need to be at 3% of GDP or 3.5% of GDP or 5% of GDP, which is great because I have a solution. We could just double all the soldiers' pay. No, think about it, right? We'll just pay them all lots of money. Because apparently the more you spend on defence as a percentage of GDP, the safer you get. That's how kind of ridiculous this is. Now, you know we're not going to double the soldiers' pay. You know we're not. But that's because you secretly know what we are going to do. We're going to buy kit from America. All right? So no one's actually pretending that spending more on defence will make us safe, because it would be easy to spend more on defence. Just make the soldiers the best paid people in the country. There, fixed it. But what we're actually going to do is buy a lot of kit. Which kit? Doesn't matter. We're paying tribute. Right? We're showing up with our presents on our little, velvet pillow. It's just a big check that says Orcus or...
Here's $800 million.
Here's $800 million. Like, what Trump is saying to the world is buy more of our kit. And if Europe won't buy more of our kit, well, don't assume that we'll be there. So, again, Europe could easily increase their defence spending by paying the soldiers more too. But you all know that's not going to happen, because you know the unsaid thing. It's just awkward to say it. The Americans are saying you better give American companies a lot of money, or we won't be there to help you in a time of need. Brackets might not be anyway. So it's fun, huh? So, Emma, not all countries sort of fall for this. Not all countries behave like this. And indeed, when here's Australia, 12th or 13th biggest economy in the world. Our GDP is about the same size as Russia's. We're 7,000 miles away from China. There's a few countries in between us. According to polling we've done, Australians are more scared of China invading Australia than people in Taiwan are scared of China invading Taiwan.
Yep.
Please discuss. We're in a university. I can write essay questions.
It is, when you put it that way, it is quite shocking, that we are so afraid. And perhaps I shouldn't be, but I am continually shocked by this. I think sometimes when I talk to people, particularly sometimes in the Australian mainstream media or in the commentariat, it becomes clear to me that many people are operating under this assumption that if the United States abandons us, or if we abandon them, if Trump unequivocally says we're not coming to save you, or leaves us alone in the world, then the very next day we'll be living under Chinese communist dictatorship. Like this is genuinely the framing that we
So this is the Sydney Morning Herald, and maybe the Age. Yep. I don't know, but
which I think we've already passed the date. 3 years ago, the Sydney Morning Herald declared that we would be at war with China in 3 years. I think the anniversary was a couple of years ago. But these
so far so good. About you guys.
But this is the assumption that drives everything, and drives, particularly in the right wing of the Australian mainstream media, this almost kind of the feverish desire to give Trump whatever he wants, that we're not being subservient enough to Trump because this is what's going to happen. But, as you pointed out, Richard, most other countries in our region, if not all, don't operate under this assumption and have been dealing with China and a complex relationship for a very long time, longer than Australia as a nation. And I think we have a lot to learn from that. And I think to the credit of this Australian government, it is actually doing quite a good job of managing what is a complex relationship with China. The Prime Minister has been in China just in the last week, and in what looks like a very successful trip. But Australia manages its relations best with China when it is operating in its own interests, rather than assuming that our interests align with the United States. But yeah, it is. I think it's confronting, to realise that this is the assumption that we make, and so our governments in particular are always, desperately asking themselves, like, who's going to come and save us? Who's going to come and look after us? But our neighbours don't think that way. They've managed to forge relatively independent paths between great powers and act in their own national interests. That's not always what Australia has done historically, but that doesn't mean that it's inevitable that we continue to behave that way. And I think that's one of the opportunities that Trump is offering us. It's offering Australia an opportunity to rethink our own interests, and particularly our own interests in our own region, and how we manage our relationships.
So Australia spends more on defence than all of the Pacific countries combined, plus Indonesia, plus Thailand, plus Malaysia, plus Vietnam. We spend more on defence than all of them combined. How come China's coming straight at us?
China is not coming straight at us. You know, it's wild that we have to say this, but like there is no evidence that there is a direct threat from China of the variety that you might read about in the Sydney Morning Herald or the Australian. You know, Australia and this Australian government, as I was just saying, actually has a quite a successful relationship with China, and China has no interest in coming for Australia in that way. You know, I don't know why we would assume that. I mean, often the spooky boys will say, well, you can't know, you know, you don't read the evidence and the intelligence that we read, and they'll talk about Chinese military build-up and what the Chinese government is doing and what Chinese intentions are, without actually understanding any of the complex history of China and China in its own region. I would always argue that China has no interest in threatening Australia. It's interested in regional stability and the stability of the Chinese regime. And that is perfectly understandable if you care to pay attention. But because we are so obsessed with this idea that somebody is coming for us, you know, sometimes
yellow arrows.
Yeah, exactly. You know, it's China now. When I was a teenager, it was Indonesia, and we were all reading Tomorrow When the War Began. You know, this is the kind of framing that drives Australian foreign policy and has for a really long time. But it's not based, I think, in evidence or reality. It's based on an assumption always that conflict and war is inevitable and there's nothing we can do about it. And that's just not true.
So early on you talked about bravery. I said we'd come back to it. You know, there is a very real war taking place in Europe right now. There is Ukraine is involved in total war with Russia, and has been for 3 years now. Barely rates a mention in most Australian newspapers most day. But right next to that war, you've got countries like Finland with a 1,300 kilometre border with that, you know, friendly neighbour Russia. How do people in Finland cope without a security guarantee from the US? No, I'm serious. Like, are they sitting there thinking there's a piece of paper that will keep them safe?
Well, no. I mean, certainly if they were, they weren't. They're not anymore after the way Trump has approached NATO. Look, I think part of what explains that is, you know, Australian geography. You know, we're an isolated continent, and I think, you know, early on in terms of our foundation, white settlers felt isolated and afraid, and that drove a lot of how they viewed the world, and a very distant world. Whereas I think, you know, Europe has had centuries of living with this kind of conflict and managing it as best they can. But I think, you know, Australia so often underestimates our ability to manage complex relationships like that. You know, we don't act like we're the 12th biggest economy in the world, but we actually have a really long and really proud history of things like peace building and supporting the development of the institutions of international law. We just don't remember that as much as we focus on our relationship with the United States. But it's perfectly possible for Australia to manage our own defence, and more importantly, I think, as the Europeans are now focusing on, is mitigating against conflict rather than assuming it's inevitable, building the structures like the European Union, as imperfect as it is, that help to mitigate against conflict and avoid conflict and build a genuine peace and connection. And we are entirely capable of that too.
We did some polling, we've done it a few times now, but we did it recently, asking Australians who they thought was the greatest threat to world peace. Why don't you tell us about what most Australians are thinking when it comes to our great protector in the US?
Yeah. This was a wild one, even for me. So those results came back, and about a third of Australia, 29%-ish of Australians said that the greatest threat to world peace was Xi Jinping. About the same amount said that the greatest threat to world peace was Vladimir Putin. The most said that Donald Trump was the greatest threat to world peace. So we are now in a situation where more Australians see the leader of our most important security ally, our best friend in the world, as a bigger threat to world peace than the leaders of the world's two most powerful authoritarian states.
So I haven't asked you this question before. I haven't asked Emma most of these questions, but so how come we're both afraid of China and the US?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we're afraid of the US for good reason now. You know, Trump has demonstrated, as he said, that he doesn't care about allies, he's even threatening to invade them. You know, maybe we should be grateful that he hasn't threatened to invade Australia just yet. Look, I think that, you know, Australians, as he said, are historically afraid or have been afraid of China more so than the Taiwanese. But I think that's also changing. Like, there's been some really interesting polling done out of UTS, out of the University of Technology Sydney, that says actually a significant number of Australians, when given the choice, rather than seeing China as a threat, they see it as a complex relationship to be managed. And so I think, you know, Trump, as he does, is revealing some things to us and also changing the way Australians feel about their region. And I mean, what I was saying earlier about Australia's relationship with the US being bigger than the defence question is also true of China. You know, there are a huge number of connections, cultural and political and historical and human, that we have with China as well. And that helps us to manage that complex relationship. So, you know, often those relationships and the way we talk about them in the mainstream media are driven by fear, but when you kind of scratch below the surface, it is a bit more complex than that. I don't think Australians are entirely capable of understanding the complexity and the nuance and not just see, as our foreign policy apparatus does, you know, threat everywhere that they look.
All right, we're nearly out of time, but I want to come back to the Orcus thing because I think it captures sort of so much of the entanglement between Australia and the US, perhaps the insecurity of... And when I talk about Australian insecurity, just to be clear, I think our kind of political elite are the insecure ones. Yeah. Like I rarely meet Australians who are like really scared of all these things, but the people we elect seem to be a lot scareder than most of us about most of these things. They're very brave when it comes to climate change. Bring it on, we'll tough it out. But they're very scared when it comes to China mounting a very large invasion over a very long distance for no particular reason. I just don't get it. But Emma, I just want to go back to AUKUS just a bit because, you know, we are trying to get people to support a petition into having an inquiry into it. So can we play a bit of a yes-no game?
Sure.
So we can just sort of clarify a few things here about AUKUS. So the AUKUS submarines, the ones that we're going to ultimately wind up with, have they been designed yet?
No.
Yes. And the English are currently working on some other nuclear submarines that aren't the ones that we want to buy. Correct? Are they on time?
No.
So what we're going to do is in 30 years buy some nuclear submarines from England that haven't been designed yet if they can finish building the ones they have designed that are running late.
Yes, and also aren't working.
And don't work.
Yeah.
And are we going to give the English government $5 billion to help them plan for the new sub they haven't designed yet?
No, that's for just the industry now to get it back on track.
So, no, the English.
Yes.
Yeah, right. So, yeah. Them too.
Yeah.
Because while we're waiting for the English sub that hasn't been designed and can't be built until they build the ones that are already behind, while we're waiting for the English sub that doesn't exist yet, we're going to get some second-hand American subs. Yeah, that's the plan?
That's the plan, yes.
That's the plan. And we've paid $1 billion to them already?
Give or take, yeah.
And the Americans are going to try to build their subs faster so that they've got some spare subs, maybe.
Yes.
And if they build their subs faster and they've got some spare subs, they'll promise to sell them to us.
No.
Oh.
They'll promise to think about it.
They'll promise to think about selling them to...
Yeah.
So so let's now summarise the deal. The Americans, we're giving them money to help them speed up making subs. And if we give them enough money that they can speed up making enough subs that they feel sub-rich and generous with their subs, they might choose to sell them to us.
Yes, at a price of their choosing.
At a time and price of their choosing.
Yes.
But they have no obligation to sell us a sub.
No, the president can decide that he doesn't want to give them to us. Yeah.
And these are the interim subs.
Yes.
That we need to get us through to the English subs that don't exist yet.
Yes.
Make sense? And to be clear, Scott Morrison thought this up. And it didn't go to Treasury and it didn't go to DFAT. And this is apparently the biggest procurement decision in Australian history. And the UK has had a parliamentary inquiry into it. By the way, we're giving them money. And the US is having an inquiry into it, and we're giving them money. But the people paying all the money don't need to have an inquiry into it.
No, apparently not. It's all cool.
So that's why we need you to sign the petition.
Yeah, and look, I should say as well, we've actually done some polling really recently that asked Australians if they would support a parliamentary inquiry into Orcus, and 66% said they would support such an inquiry with very good reason, because it's an outrageous plan, as Malcolm Turnbull said in that video. It's a terrible mistake, and so I think it's only right that Parliament should do its job and do a review into this deal. As you said, the Americans are doing one right now. It's likely that they'll come back and say, sure, you can have it if you pay us more money and promise us that if we ever go to war with China, you'll use the subs the way that we tell you to. The Brits have had an inquiry into the deal as well, which, as you say, they're pretty happy with because we're giving them plenty of money. But it's outrageous, I think, that in a democracy we've had no parliamentary review of this deal, no real even conversation about whether it's what we want or what we need.
And to be clear, we've already given the Americans our first check.
Yep.
And they're already having an inquiry into whether they want to do the deal. We've paid the down payment.
We have, and it's worth emphasising, we don't get it back.
Yeah. And to be clear, the money we're giving them is to help the American ship industry build American subs faster for Americans. Because if the Americans build enough subs for the Americans that the Americans think the Americans have got spare subs, then the Americans might sell us one maybe a bit. It's not refundable. And to be clear, we can't afford to tackle climate change. Yeah, good question. Why is Anthony Albanese going along with this?
Well, I think the Australian government, this was sprung on the Labor Party overnight, as it was sprung on the Australian people, and I think that they agreed to it for very understandable political reasons, in the context of the time. And then I think have continued to go along with it for similar reasons. They don't want to have a debate about national security because the built-in assumption of Australian politics is that people think the coalition are better at national security than Labor. That is, again, not a reflection of reality. Polling in the lead up to the election found very clearly that Australians think that Anthony Albanese is better placed to manage the relationship and Australian foreign policy more generally. So they are still going along with it in public statements, in the way that they talk about it. But I think there is increasingly room to move on it. I think if you look at the way the Prime Minister is speaking about defence spending that we talked about earlier, the way that he's talking about Australia's role in the world, and if you look at what's happening in the party more broadly, at the grassroots of the party, at the branch level, there's deep unhappiness with the deal. There's deep unhappiness in the Australian community about the deal. So I think, things are inevitable and ingrained and subject to bipartisan consensus until they're not. And I think things can change really quickly. I think the Australian community is ahead there in the way that they see this deal. But, I think it's also possible that Trump will force the question. If they do come back with this review and say, well, you have to promise in perpetuity that you'll follow you'll follow the United States into a war with China. No sovereign government can agree to that. And so I'm hopeful that things will change.
So America might save us from Orcus.
Yes. Well, and look, I think there are some people in the government who are very much hoping that was going to happen.
Me too. Yeah. One last question before we let Emma go sign some books. So other countries, I think, are coping with Trump 2.0 differently than Trump 1.0, and indeed differently to Australia. Our Prime Minister's promised a progressive patriotism. What lessons, if any, can we learn from other countries? Maybe Canada being a standout one.
Yeah, I think Canada's a really good example, and I think the election result there and the election result here as well shows that there is real community support for pushing back against the worst instincts of Trumpism. I think that was more obvious in Canada because of very specific geographic and political circumstances, that there was this willingness to push back on the Americans, to the point where, at ice hockey games, Canadians were booing the American national anthem. There was a real upswelling, I think, of progressive patriotism in response to Trump. And I think there are real political lessons there. And I think, I hope that the Australian government is starting to respond to that in a way that it is pushing back in some ways against Trumpism. For an Australian Prime Minister to respond to a US Secretary of Defence demanding we spend more money on defence by saying, actually, no, Australia decides on how we spend our defence money, that might not seem like a big deal, but in the history of Australia's relationship with America, that's a big deal for a Prime Minister to say that. So I think there are absolutely lessons there. I think the Australian community, by and large, as shown by the election, as shown by how we're responding to Trump generally, is hugely supportive of Australia developing some independence, which doesn't mean going it alone. It means having some independence in our decision making and pushing back against the worst instincts of Trumpism. I think there's a huge amount of political support, and we can see that here, we can see it in Canada, I think we can see it in Europe as well, we can see it in the Pacific, and we just have to hope, I think, and push our government to be brave and to embrace that.
Thanks. All right, well, I'm going to wrap us up now, but before I do, I just want to make a couple of observations. One, thank you very much for coming along tonight. Look around. Look, it's a full house. We're often told in Australia that nobody cares about these things. We're often told that that people are disengaged from politics. Well, I don't know about you, but I think I've got the best job in the world. I get to travel around talking to people about things that I'm interested in, and then sit and hide from everyone and write about things that I'm interested in. Doesn't get better than that for me. So I go to events like this all the time. And they're always full houses. And Australia's chock full of people who care about these things. But we're often told that's not the case. Now, we had a tight conversation tonight. We didn't have time for questions from the audience, but I promise you if we did, the one question would come up. It comes up every time. And it's a well-meaning question. It's like, oh, Richard, that's great, thank you. But you know what? You're preaching to the converted. And what are you really doing to change the country? And I say, well, actually, you know what? This isn't the only event we do, and we do them all around the country, not just in the city of Melbourne. But here's the key point. You know what the churches have done every Sunday for 1,000 years? Preach to the converted. It's the best fucking organising strategy in the world. No, but again, it's been flipped on its head for us. Oh, sure, you care, and lots of people you know care, and you come together and you see that you're not alone in caring, but no one else does. It's not true. Democracy is a participation event. Democracy thrives on high expectations. Democracy needs people to care about things. If we all sit back and say we can't change anything, you know what? We won't change anything. American defence companies don't get to vote in elections, right? And there's, did you know the 2025 federal election is still going? Yeah. You know what I'm talking about? Right. That the Libs are appealing in the seat of Bradfield, right? Because the seat was won by 26 votes. All right. And they're off to the High Court. Because you know what? Every vote matters. 26 votes in that electorate. There's no such thing as a safe seat. One of the Canberra electorates have been was on a 16% margin before the election. It's now Labor's most marginal seat in the country. Right? So democracy thrives on high expectations. People do care about these things. And the people who want to keep things the way they are have done a great job of convincing people who do care that you're alone. And that's why I love coming to events like this, because you're not alone, and neither are most Australians who think that the kind of things that Emma's been writing about make a bit of sense, and maybe we should listen to her. So how about a round of applause for Emma?
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.